Folks, I'm absolutely delighted to have a chance to talk to Lawrence Hill, one of Canada's most eminent authors, a brilliant writer who's brought sort of the experience of Black Canadians and Black North Americans to the attention of our country and the world, who has a really interesting connection with the Alaska Highway. So Lawrence, delighted you could be with us today. Please tell me how you got interested in this project.
Thank you so much. And I'm so delighted to speak with you. But as for how I first heard about the highway, I was invited to speak at a conference of historians, like an American Historical Association conference in Toronto. It was the first time they were holding one in Canada. And this was years ago. And I was invited to moderate a discussion among 3 historians. And I initially declined. And I said, you don't want me doing this. I'm a novelist. Like, nobody's going to want me moderating a discussion about among historians. And they asked me again, and I agreed. And one of the presenters was a man who'd done a documentary film interviewing former soldiers, African-American soldiers that helped build the Alaska Highway. And this story absolutely riveted me, watching these men on tape, talking about their experiences. And I remember actually the tiniest detail, which is so striking. One of the men talked about how they were fed so terribly while they were up in the north that all the soldiers got terribly constipated. And it was a real issue for them. And they really struggled with horrendous constipation because the food was so awful for so long in the north. And when would a novelist ever have thought of that? Like, that would not have crossed my mind as a problem that the soldiers were facing. But watching that documentary video some years ago led me to start coming to the Yukon. And now I've been a few times, sometimes for a few months, other times for a couple of weeks, to spend time traveling the Alaska Highway, which I've now traveled twice, and living in Dawson City and in Whitehorse. So I've become very passionate about this story. And I guess as a novelist, the thing that interests me is to find an aspect of Black history that is well documented, but that people know very little about. Most people, like most Canadians. And if you talk to 1,000 Canadians, chances are you wouldn't meet more than 2 who'd heard that thousands of African Americans helped build the Alaska Highway during the Second World War in northern BC, Yukon, and Alaska. So it's perfect for me.
It is perfect for you, and you're perfect for it, by the way. This is going to blow this story up into a great sort of level. I grew up along the Alaska Highway and in Whitehorse. And in fact, at the time, we heard almost nothing about the African-American soldiers who were there. There were some pictures at the opening ceremonies, and that sort of got a fair amount of attention. But you had a chance to look at this a little bit. Most of the soldiers who came up north came from the deep American South. And they used to have a rule in the US Army that you could not send African-American troops to cold, wet areas. So they decided to send them to the Yukon in the middle of February and March of 1942. What was that experience like, do you think?
Well, I have read a number of accounts and of course seen lots of photos of these Black soldiers. And well, initially some of them were equipped in rubber boots. They were often given inferior equipment. And often if soldiers in regiments of white soldiers needed equipment and the Black soldiers have it, they just take it from them. And so they're often working with their hands or in very elementary ways when other soldiers that were better equipped who were white had better equipment. I know that officers traveled in advance of the Black soldiers and told Indigenous peoples that the Black soldiers had tails and would rape people with impunity, and they had to stay away because the Black men had tails. And so some of the information that was seeded in these communities by officers traveling in advance of the Black soldiers was horrendous. And so it seems to me that although I'm sure there were moments of kindness and interaction that was beautiful, there was also a deep bed of racism that greeted these soldiers in Canada.
And that's part of the story we probably don't talk about very much at all. When the troops, for example, came to Whitehorse, they refused to let them stay in Whitehorse. They marched them out of town right away, moved them about 20 miles away. They didn't have any equipment, didn't have any bulldozers and trucks and things like that. So they made them to start building the Alaska Highway by hand, which is just absurd at the level. You might enjoy this though. One of the things the Black soldiers did was they discovered that they could actually take their sleeping bags and cut a hole and 3 holes in them and put one over their heads and put their arms out. And that's what they wore outside, because it actually kept them warm over that period of time. So why do you think this story disappeared? Why do you think this story, which is so riveting, and as you described it as riveting, you're absolutely right. Why do you think it disappeared?
Well, the story of the Alaska Highway hasn't disappeared. And the story of the construction of the highway and this mighty effort through the Great North, that has prevailed. It's perhaps not as big a story in the psyche of North Americans to say the building of the railroad or something like that, but it's there. And many people know about the Alaska Highway. So in my opinion, the question is more, why is the story of the Blacks who helped build the highway, why is that part of it disappeared? And I think it's because largely synonymous with other aspects of Black culture and Black people and Black history is something that's been forgotten or swept under the rug, especially in Canada, at least in the United States, with all of its problems. There hasn't been such an avid effort, and sometimes unconscious too, to sweep Black history under the rug. But in Canada, it's like we've willfully kind of like happily forgotten about it. And it's not taught in our schools, and children don't learn about it. And we know more about American history involving Black people than we do about Canadian. Most of us in Canada at least do. And so I think it's reflective of how how the school system and how the public at large considers Black people and considers Black history. And it's still largely unknown, except for a few, obvious exceptions like the Underground Railroad or something.
Right. So I've had a chance to speak to a few of the Black soldiers who worked on the highway. I did start doing interviews back 25, 30 years ago. And they saw this as a very central element in their lives. They're extremely proud of the work that they did and the circumstances. I mean, they were kind of making fun of, they'd forgotten how cold it was, and they made fun of how they survived up in the air and all that kind of stuff. Is that your impression as well, that the Black soldiers saw this as a turning point in their own personal lives and perhaps in the experience of Black soldiers more generally?
Yes, and I think that many Canadians and Americans don't really understand, or of course wouldn't remember, especially if they're young, or wouldn't know if they're young, that there was a profound hunger among African Americans and African Canadians to serve the forces, the Allied forces in say the 2 world wars. Why? Well, of course, many people felt this, not just Black people, but Black people felt it, one, because as regular people, they wanted to serve their country, they wanted to serve the Allies. But in addition to that, they wanted profoundly to prove their worthiness as citizens and to serve in the forces, Canadian, American, Allied, whatever, would prove somehow, they hoped, that they are worthy of full citizenship. And if they're good enough to die for the country, surely they'd be good enough to transcend segregation after the war ended. And so for Black people, it was extremely important to serve in the wars, and they did with great pride. And so, yes, I too have heard, stories and read accounts of how proud these soldiers were to serve, even in these very difficult situations. For me, the bugs must have been the worst, like to be just devoured by bugs in the summer in the woods. I think I would have much preferred the winter.
Yes, well, they did a whole bunch of the construction in the wintertime. And then when the Black soldiers were working on, and then when the spring thaw came, the road was washed out. They lost many bridges, they lost big parts of the road and all that kind of stuff. I think people also, when talking about the Alaska Highway, forget there were sort of 3 phases to it. One phase was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And then there's a small part of that, or a significant part, but was the role of the Black soldiers, both on the Alaska Highway, also on the Canal Pipe project. They also forget that there was a big civilian project that came right afterwards, and they were starting to build, the Public Roads Administration started building a civilian highway. And it seems to me those 2 non-Black processes sort of overwhelmed the story and pushed the sort of Black soldiers into the background. What's your story going to tell us? What is your novel you're working on going to bring to light that we don't know about the experience of Black soldiers in the North?
Well, I mean, I guess what I would hope for any work of drama, that I would create, any work of dramatic fiction, would be to just help people see and empathize in a compassionate and human way, to see the humanity, to see the people, to see their struggles, to feel their lives, to understand what it might have felt like. So I mean, I think a historian or journalist is much better placed to convey a great deal of factual information. And of course, it's very important to me as a novelist who writes about history to include lots of interesting factual tidbits, lots of interesting bits of information. But mostly that's to create an aura of verisimilitude, an aura of reality, so the reader will believe and feel the environment they're asking them to step into. But I think that if it's really about facts and super great details, and you're better off reading a historian or a journalistic account. But if you're looking to sort of expand your heart and to kind of grow your compassion about what this life might have looked like, what kind of personal struggles, medical struggles, romantic struggles, health struggles, racial issues that people would have been living and facing, then I'm hoping to sort of dramatize that, just so an ordinary person, whether they're living in Fairbanks or Dallas or Montreal, could sort of appreciate what this life might have looked like. And I'm also very interested in the intersections of people. We have Indigenous people, we have Black people, we have this rabid fear of the Japanese, when of course we have white settlers, we have interactions of all people. I've even interviewed some of the children, who are now well into their 70s, who are the results of brief romantic liaisons between Dene women and some of these African-American soldiers who are building the Canal pipeline. And so even that, is something that's interesting to explore, because of course these encounters were verboten, they were forbidden, but people being people, they're going to meet anyway, regardless of the rules.
Well, we are looking forward to your book. Your conversation today has been absolutely brilliant. I think you're absolutely right. We historians can talk about structural things. We can talk about the number of miles of road built and the number of bridges constructed and the amount of money spent and the technical processes and all that kind of stuff. But I love the way you sort of narrow down to things that really matter, like bugs and food and going to the bathroom and those relationships which were so fundamental. And in fact, the memories of those remain, the relationships between the local populations and the Black soldiers remain very much alive along the Alaska Highway, but not so much in the public view. You've done an amazing job of bringing the sort of experience of Black people to the attention of Canadians in so many ways. You've done a remarkable career of promoting the experience of Black people in ways that the rest of us can understand and sort of empathize with in very dramatic sort of fashion. So please get that pen going. Write the story of the Alaska Highway. We're all looking forward to it, Lawrence. Lawrence Hill, thank you very, very much for this wonderful interview.
Thank you so much, Ken. I look forward to coming to see you in Saskatchewan.